Hi guys, I'm George. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I'm here in the Somerset countryside in the southwest of England. And I'm going to paint some of this scenery behind me. So the weather today has been really temperamental. We've had rain in the morning, really strong winds, and then a little bit of sun breaking out here and there. So I think the weather is going to be a bit temperamental throughout the painting. But hopefully I can capture some of the atmosphere of the weather and the winter landscape. One thing I love about the countryside around here is you have quite dramatic hills, lots of rolling hills and plains where you get a really nice view off into the distance. You can really see that aerial perspective. I'm not quite sure how the weather is going to be whilst I paint, but I am expecting some changes, definitely in the clouds, a bit of sun, a bit of rain. Please do subscribe to my YouTube channel and let's start painting here in the countryside of Somerset.
I'm painting on an offcut of canvas that I've taped to a plywood panel and I've toned to a light grey. Using burnt umber paint, I'm sketching in the underdrawing of my composition. Here it may look like I'm about to begin a game of noughts and crosses or tic-tac-toe for my American viewers. However, this simple grid I've sketched is actually a really useful tool in order to place the different elements in the scene correctly in relation to one another. Using my burnt umber paint with a touch of ultramarine blue added to my brush, as well as a bit of my painting medium to thin the paint, I begin placing the big shapes of my scene, starting with this hill in the midground which slopes down steeply in a curved diagonal line across my painting and is outlined by the dark masses of winter trees which frame it against the sky and the cool light tones of the distant hills. I've also marked the foreground mass of land, which also slopes down diagonally from right to left across the scene. I'm using my burnt umber paint with a touch of ultramarine blue and alizarin crimson to thinly mass in the darkest sections of my painting, and I'm analysing the placement of the various components in the scene as I go. I find it helpful to aim early on for a simple monochromatic painting consistent of the darkest masses against the light tone of the canvas, as when the scene gets closer to how it appears in nature, the easier it becomes to judge the shapes that I've placed and compare these to nature, as mistakes become easy to spot when working in tonal masses as opposed to just working with line. I would also add that with a scene like this and in landscape painting in general, it's not quite as important to position everything in a way that is completely true to nature, like when you paint a portrait or a figure, where even small mistakes in the drawing can be very noticeable. As with landscapes, people won't notice if areas aren't painted completely true to nature, and in fact change in some sections like increasing the size of the hill or things like this can actually make for a better painting, and many painters throughout history would change things in the landscape in order to paint a more powerful or harmonious composition. For this reason, I like to get through the underdrawing stage of the painting when working en plein air quite quickly, as ultimately with the landscape painting, the most important aspects are the tonal values that will capture the sense of depth and the light effect throughout the painting. Here I'm sketching the outline of the clouds, as I like the shapes that they have at the moment, with sections in sunlight and sections in shadow, as well as having some areas of the blue sky breaking through. And I'm aware that the sky might change or go completely grey, so I'm going to try and keep to this initial sketch as much as possible, unless it changes in a way that I feel looks better. Now I'm painting the section of sky above the horizon, which is a light cool grey. I've also added a few dabs of paint to the lightest sections of the clouds, using a colour mix of titanium white with a very small touch of cadmium yellow. To paint the shadow sections of the clouds, I'm using a colour mix of titanium white, ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, and a touch of burnt umber. I've also added a small touch of Naples yellow and cadmium red to warm the colour mix up a bit. And although this section on the clouds is darker than the light section, It's not very dark in the grand scheme of things, especially when compared to other sections in the scene. For this reason, I'm still adding quite a lot of titanium white to these shadows. Here I'm mixing the colour for the blue section of the sky. Whenever you need to mix a colour for a large area of your painting, I recommend using a palette knife rather than trying to mix the colour using your brush, as the palette knife allows you to pick up more paint so you can easily mix a decent sized colour mix. It's also cleaner and can be easily wiped off, so you can have more control over the colour. Whereas if you try to mix the paint using your brush, the paint can get stuck in the hairs of your brush, which can lead to mixing a muddier colour. For the sky colour, I'm using a mix of titanium white, cobalt blue, turquoise, ultramarine blue, and a touch of burnt umber, which is basically a complementary of blue, so it helps tone down the chroma of the blue a bit. As on a day like this, the blue in the sky isn't very chromatic, and in general, the blue sky in England isn't as strong a blue as the blue you see in the sky in the Mediterranean or in the tropics. And as I paint the sky, there is a subtle gradation from a light pale blue lower down in the sky, which is slightly warmer, to a deeper, slightly darker blue further up. So whilst I've been painting, and you may have noticed in the background that the weather has been really challenging, with moments of strong freezing winds, as well as hail and rain, with brief moments of sunshine. However, the dramatic weather has presented itself with something that I really wasn't expecting, and that is a really clear, beautiful rainbow, which is a really striking sight, and I've decided that I will add this into my painting a bit later on. As I paint the land, there is a clear gradation in tonal value and chroma, with the areas in the distance being lighter and greyer in colour, with less tonal contrast, and as the land gets closer to the foreground, the tonal contrast increases, with areas of deep darks and light highlights, and the chroma in the colours also increases. It's good to be consciously aware of this as you paint, as it's this gradation in tonal values and colour chroma that will give your painting a sense of depth and atmospheric perspective. I always used to find tackling open vistas like this a bit intimidating, because I'd look out across the vast open landscape and see all the different fields and hedges and multitudes of trees, and I'd find it a bit overwhelming, just the thought of trying to paint everything, especially in one plein air painting session like the one I'm doing here. But what I learned is it really helps to play down the details in the distance to a point where things far away become almost indistinguishable, and then save the meticulous details for the foreground where they really count. And by doing this, it will not just help you save time, but it will also paint a clearer image with a good sense of depth. And a good way to check your values is to squint at the scene and see which areas still stand out and which areas vanish into the surrounding areas. You can then squint to your painting to see how these tonal values relate. To paint the land in the very foreground, the separation is visually subtle, as there isn't a line of trees and hedges outlining it like there is on the hill behind. However, it's still important that the separation of this section is clear, as clarity in landscape painting is one of the things which makes an image appealing to look at. I can see that where the foreground land crosses the midground, it's a bit lighter and has a yellower green hue, and I'm pushing this yellow hue slightly more in order to help visually distinguish the foreground land from the midground. Also, as this section is closest to me, the contrast is clearer for me to see, and I'm first adding the dark sections of shadow within the grass. I can then paint around this with mid-tone greens, and finally add some small lighter highlights to the grass. And having this increased tonal contrast in the foreground, along with the details and sharper focus, it will help add a stronger sense of depth to the scene as a result, as well as adding a bit more visual interest to this massive green which takes up the lower third of my composition. One of the most challenging things about painting in the rain, other than the physical discomfort, is that it makes it harder to mix the paint and apply the paint to the canvas, as oil paint and water don't mix. So although this saves my painting from getting completely washed off by the rain, it does make it much harder to apply the paint to the wet surface, as it just doesn't go on as easily. Also, when the hairs of your paintbrush get wet, they lose the spring in the brush, and the brushes just won't keep their shape as well when applying the brush strokes. And although I'm sharing my process about how I'm doing this painting, this isn't so much of a tutorial on how to paint in the rain, because my setup here isn't ideal. Ideally, I'd have a separate tripod with a clear or a white umbrella that would go over my painting and over my palette, and that way the paint wouldn't get on to my palette and onto the painting. And also, having a clear or a white umbrella will mean that sunlight will still be able to light my painting, so I won't be painting in the dark. And I have actually made a more in-depth tutorial on how to paint in the rain, so I will link that to this video at the end if you're interested.
So if you've been following my YouTube channel for a while, or my Instagram, and you're thinking that this scene looks somewhat familiar, that's because I have painted in this exact spot before. However, last time I painted here, it was a few years ago, and I had my canvas in a portrait orientation, and although it was a similar time of year, the sky was quite different, with a lot more blue sky on the day I painted before. And as much as I enjoy painting in different locations, there is something quite nice about painting in a familiar spot and viewing the landscape again with a fresh eye. And I find it speaks to that old saying that a man never steps in the same river twice, because it's not the same river and he is not the same man. And I believe when the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus said that, and I believe he is the one that this quote is attributed to, he might as well have been speaking about plein-air painting, as the landscape will have changed, and more significantly, the artist will have changed too, and hopefully for the better in my case, but I'll let you guys decide that. But seriously, the artist's mood and inspiration at the time will impact the way that the scene is depicted, as well as his or her technical skill and perhaps what sort of paintings they've been looking at, or the weather on the day. So even if you are going to paint in the same spot, it doesn't necessarily mean that your painting is going to be that similar to your previous painting in the same spot. Here I'm using the finest brush that I have to carefully paint the trunk and branches of the distant trees. I find it helpful to thin the paint down slightly in order for me to paint a finer and longer line, as the drier the paint is, the shorter the distance the paint can be dragged across the surface. So keeping the paint loose really helps me paint these lines in one go, and applying the brush stroke in one direction prevents the paint from mixing with the paint underneath, and that way it gives me a really nice, crisp, bold line which articulates the branches or the trunk of the tree.
If you enjoyed that video, please do give me a thumbs up and do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. You can also ring that little notification bell, so that way you won't miss out on any of my new videos. And you can follow me on Instagram at George Frederick Thomas. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.